Consider this. Humanity is at its greatest need, okay, for critical thought, and yet it is completely unaware of it. Think about what that means for a second. Let me repeat it. Humanity is at its greatest need for critical thought, more now than ever, and yet it is completely unaware of it. Now, when I say completely, does that mean every single individual on planet Earth is unaware of the necessity for critical thought? No. But to the extent of which it is needed for the collective, for most of us to know, yeah, you can't use that word that we know. We are completely unaware as a human species of our need, of the necessity for critical thought. And we're at a point in time where we need it the most. So this is, for lack of a better term, it's a pickle. We find ourselves in a pickle. What does it mean to think critically, to begin with? You are listening to me right now. Something gave you the curiosity to click on a video and listen to me. Was there an element of critical thought in that decision? Did you say to yourself, you know what? I think it's going to be important for me to enlighten myself on whatever this video means to convey like message. Or was it something that influenced you into clicking this video and watching and listening? Chances are it's a little bit of both. But at the end of the day, you can argue about the philosophy of it. Are we actually ever in control? Are we making decisions? Are we not making decisions? Is there some kind of soul? Is there a decision that I make that's separate than just my consciousness? These are questions that we've been talking about forever. So we'll never really understand critical thought in the absolute way we would like to prove it, or seem to think that we should prove it, so that we can move forward in these sort of rough times. And when I say rough, I mean risky, actually. I can explain that in a little bit greater detail. There are two sort of worldviews in which people sort of come to a standstill with when it comes to the idea of consciousness and critical thought. One is called infinite regress, and the other is called a universal constant. So what does it mean to come to a standstill with infinite regress? Well, to understand whether you are really thinking, or is it just your brain that's sort of thinking, or is there something behind the brain, behind consciousness, or is consciousness all there is? You have to observe consciousness to try to understand that. And when you go in and you observe consciousness, that which is observing that consciousness is consciousness itself. So if I'm looking at a brain and I try to understand it, I break it down to all its little minute parts. I myself am a brain. So I can't completely really understand the nature of what that brain and what that consciousness is, because I'm applying my subjective view as to what it is. I don't actually have the ability to create, even through my instrumentation, I do not have the ability to create an objective, real form of proof or concept that could allow me to understand consciousness. And even if I were to understand consciousness, at least what I think would be how consciousness works, well, whatever or whoever it is that were to understand that consciousness, well, who understands that person's consciousness? If God exists and can explain it to us, who can explain to us God's consciousness? Who created God? And so this is why we call it infinite regress. It is infinitely regressive. It'll always be a question of questions. Well, whose consciousness is that? Who created this? Who created that, right? And so on and so forth. So some people come to the worldview at a standstill with infinite regress. They say, well, it's just absurd, right? It's infinitely regressive, so there's nothing to talk about. There's no need to question reality, and ultimately it's just absurd. So there's no need to question it. And then there's no possible answers. So yeah, there's no need to question it. And there's a universal constant where people say, well, I mean, consciousness pervades the universe. It pervades existence. It's outside of the realm of space and time. That's all there is. It's just consciousness. So there's, at that point, also no need to question anything. There's an answer for it. So you can see how this sort of binary position where you're either on one side or the other is what has allowed us to not think critically anymore. Or actually, I would say has allowed us to sink into this comfortable sort of, seemingly comfortable sort of slope where we think there's no need for critical thought because there is either no question to begin with or there is an answer there already. So I could go into detail as to why I think that's wrong, because I think both simultaneously exist, but that's a whole other story. For right now, all of this is abstracts, and I may have already lost you. Right? You may actually not be there. Maybe you're thinking about something else while I'm talking in the background, and I'm just sort of like the background noise, or you're not even watching this video anymore. So in this context, what I want to do is get away from the philosophical sort of abstract part of it. And I want to sort of give a really good example as to what really is practical and useful to know. And hopefully afterwards, you'll understand that what I was talking about in terms of consciousness, infinite regress, universal constants, blah, 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 all this metaphysical kind of abstractions, you'll start to see how the nature of what we do as human beings to think about things like that. Maybe not at that level, you don't have to think about those things, but you'll start to understand how the process of thought that goes into thinking about things like that is very important. That is critical thought, basically, because it impacts us in the real world, so to speak. Your subjective experience is influenced by the fact that humanity does or does not think critically. And you'll see that very, very clearly in about 6 or 7 minutes of Yuval Harari giving a speech that he's given in the last 2-3 years over and over again, but nonetheless needs to be heard by as many people as possible. So let's go to my Google and listen to Mr. Yuval Harari.
Yeah, technological revolutions, and especially the automation revolution that has to do with AI, will create a far more fluid, flexible job market than anything we've seen before. A lot of jobs and even entire professions will be automated and disappear. New jobs will appear, or jobs will change. It's very difficult to predict exactly which jobs will disappear, but it's very likely that, say, by 2040 or 2050, many of the things that people do today will be done by computers and robots, and people will do different things. Now, the kind of apocalyptic scenario that there are no jobs left for humans, this is not going to happen, certainly not within a time frame of, say, 20, 30 years. The real problem will be one of retraining and adapting and adjusting. As old jobs disappear and new jobs emerge, the question is, can you retrain the workforce fast enough? And this demands both learning new skills and also psychological adjustments to basically reinvent yourself, to adopt a new professional identity. And maybe you do it when you're 30 and again when you're 40, but will you do it again when you're 50 and 60 and 70? And again, because of medical advances, life expectancy increased quite substantially. So we are looking at this combination of people living longer, but with a much more volatile job market and economy. So the old idea of having a job for life or a profession for life, this is going to be completely untenable. So from the viewpoint of, say, even the trade unions, the traditional strategy that we need to protect the jobs and we need to protect the benefits of particular jobs, this is going to be less and less relevant and actually very dangerous. Instead, there should be a switch to we need to protect the workers, the people. There is no way to keep these jobs because the economy has moved on, the technology has moved on. But we need to retrain the people, support them while they are in transition, and also support them psychologically against the shocks involved. Also, some people, especially as they get older, might find it almost impossible to continue this constant process of reinvention and adaptation. And we might have on our hands a larger and larger class of people who are not unemployed, but unemployable, just gave up. It's too much for them. And we need to take it into account when planning our social system. So this is something that we certainly businesses can play a role in, but the crucial role should be that of the government. Step in. And just as in the 19th and 20th century, governments in Europe built a mass education system for youngsters. We now need to build a lifelong education system, which is a task that really only governments can fulfill. And also to build a social safety net to protect individuals during the difficult transition period. And the key idea is that the AI revolution will not be this single watershed event. We have the big AI revolution in 2030, lots of jobs disappear, new jobs emerge, you have a few rough years of readjusting, and by 2040, everything has settled down to a new economic. No, it won't be like that. You'll have a big shock in 2030, an even bigger shock in 2040, an even bigger shock in 2050, because AI is nowhere near its full potential. It will continue to increase in competence. And as it increases in competence, it will push humans out of some jobs. It will completely change other jobs. And again, it's not always the most, it's not obvious where it will hit first. It's like if you compare, say, doctors and nurses. So some people imagine, well, nurses, they are low down the rank than doctors. They will be hit first. But no, actually, doctors, many of them, basically just process information. They take in information about the patient, ask some questions, they do some tests, then they process the information, and then out comes data, information about prescriptions or treatments. This is the easiest thing to automate. A nurse, in contrast, she has, or he has, many more diverse skills. He or she needs motor skills, they need good social skills to give an injection to a crying boy or to change bandages to a patient in severe pain. We need a lot of skills. We are going to have AI doctors long before we have AI nurses. So it's going to be very hectic and complicated. And I don't think there is any way that the private sector is going to handle it by itself. The governments will have to step in and create these safety nets.
All right, so that's quite a lot of information. Okay, so there's a couple of things here. The first one is, let's start with a word. The word automation, okay? This sort of idea that this AI revolution, which is artificial intelligence, will create this useless class, meaning that so many people will be out of work because, you know, robots come in to do the work for us instead, or softwares or whatever it is. This is, in fact, is actually true. I mean, we're starting to see it already today. Unfortunately, a lot of people don't know this. So like I said, we need a lot of critical thinking, and yet people they're not aware that we need critical thought. Now, it kind of seems contradictory here because you say, well, If there's not going to be any work in the future for any of us, why would we need critical thought so much? Well, that's the whole point. Because if you're stuck without any job, anything to do, right? And you're the kind of person who defines themselves by what they do, what do you think is going to happen? Yeah, I'm a lawyer. That's who I am. That's what I do. Ask anybody. Ask anybody that question. What do you do? Or who are you? Right? Actually, who are you? Ask them. And they'll say what? They'll bring up what they do in life. That is the first thing, 9 times out of 10. People identify themselves by what they do. So if there's nothing to do for a lot of people, or if what they do will change, or if what they do will no longer be good and they'll have to move on towards something else, it's really going to bring in this sort of vacuum that's going to make a lot of people question who they are and what it is that their purpose is in life. It'll get them to question every stick of their personality, the entire foundation of what allows them to live day to day, right? To wake up in the morning and to go out there and grind. All of that will come to a screeching halt as soon as the automation starts making itself very apparent. Okay? A lot of people find themselves out of work, whatever. We don't need, 40%, 50% of people out of work for there to be a catastrophe, philosophically speaking. You only need a few million people. You only need a few million people in each country to find themselves out of work and not have the ability to understand themselves, what we call interpersonal skills, right? You need to know interpersonal skills is the idea that you understand how you function, who you are deep down and fundamentally speaking, what your emotions are all about, how they're related to your behavior, all these kinds of things. Well, these things, they necessitate emotional intelligence and critical thought, which is, I'm sorry to say, very, very sorely lacking. If you don't have those things to allow you to move forward into a different kind of career field, or not even work, but what if it's possible that universal basic income can cover your lifestyle or your survival, I should say, then you're going to have to create a lifestyle for yourself. Already, it's an issue that we've seen in the past 30, 40 years. In the past 30, 40 years, we have had more time, more free time to do with what we want than every other generation on planet Earth since since the beginning of the history of humans. We have, let's say, the average person works 40 hours a week. Just about 100 years ago, you didn't work 40 hours a week. You worked 70, 80, 90, 100 hours a week just to be able to eat. Where are you going to find time? Only the rich had the time to learn instruments and do poetry, calligraphy. This was an aristocratic sort of privilege. Today, it's no longer seen as a privilege to be able to have the time to learn how to play an instrument. It's just seen as, oh, yeah, whatever. You have your free time. You work with these 40 hours, and the rest you sort of do what you want. Well, I'm sorry. This is just not the way things used to be, and it's not necessarily the way things, should be. I mean, obviously, you want to spend the rest of your free time doing something that will allow you to feel happy and free. And yet people aren't happy. People aren't free. They use that time to do what? To get away, as far away from this sort of feeling that they get because of the jobs that they do, which just makes them so unhappy. And if it's a job that does make them happy, what do they do with the rest of the time? They don't see their job as jobs anymore. They just see it as doing what they love and living. And yet you can't just live doing one thing 24/7. So people, regardless of if they have time or don't have time, or have work or don't have work, people are really, really struggling to find out, hey, what's the meaning of life? What's the purpose of it all, right? So it's already an issue today in the past 30, 40 years, and it's just crept on us like that without us realizing it. And we're heading into a future where things are going to continuously change, dramatically so, and faster and faster. So the one thing that you can take away from everything that I'm saying what Yuval is saying and what other people are starting to talk about is that, one, you should know yourself. And to do that, you need critical thinking. You need critical thought. You need to meditate, which is not just sort of the practice of going to hot yoga or sitting there in your apartment kind of listening to, some sort of, gong type soundtrack and try to push all the thoughts out of your mind. What I mean by meditation is a lot more complex, but if it at least gets you started to look down into that sort of field and try to understand what it means to meditate, you're going to have to. That's part of critical thought. To think critically is to also be able to balance out the need to not have to think, right? And that comes through meditation. So, yeah, I think I'm going to leave it at that for this video. If people are interested in hearing more, and if I get a sort of reaction as to what they want to know about, then I'll have to make a video based on whatever you decide. I think this is a good start. All right, bye-bye.